Hi, I'm Ben Burgess. I'm the author of Give Them an Argument, Logic for the Left, forthcoming next year from Zero Books. And today I'd like to talk about the intellectual dark web.
Hello, I'm Grim. I am a game designer and a writer. I have qualifications in politics and history, all of which makes me probably better entitled to make observations on this topic than any philosopher. I'm in a weird position. Ideologically, I'm more of an anarchist. Pragmatically, I'm more of a socialist. Engels would have dismissed me as a utopian, but I think my thinking is more in line with the Fabian Society, perhaps. Gradualism, not revolutionary, that people can be persuaded, that change can be managed rather than being revolutionary. Now, despite what he said there, this video is supposed to be about the question, did Marx kill millions? Well, even he'd have had to have been a busy little bee for him to do something like that all by himself, but his ideology certainly has led to millions upon millions of deaths, as other ideologies have. But I don't agree with Marxists like this fellow, and I don't agree with people like Jordan Peterson or Ben Shapiro on this. I take a view in the middle, kind of, not exactly centrism. I just think they're both wrong. This guy wanders a bit, talks about a few other topics. This was hosted on Zero Books, which is a worthwhile channel if you want to observe a left-wing perspective. They produced Angela Nagle's Kill All Normies, which I did a lengthy critique of on this channel. But let's see what interesting things this guy has to say.
It seems to me that everybody has been hearing a lot about them lately, which makes their branding a little strange, a little hard to understand. Because my understanding is that the actual dark web is about sketchy, illegal stuff that doesn't show up in Google searches.
I think dark web is the wrong comparison, but the point is that they've moved on to the internet and social media and so on because of the oppressive atmosphere in academia and now increasingly in technology. I think a more apposite comparison would be made to the Republic of Letters or the Invisible College or the back-channel scientific communication that used to go on between Soviet and American scientists during the Cold War. The point is they're people who have problems with the system and in the system as it currently exists, and who have participated in or supported things that have shown that there is a big problem. SoCal Squared, for example. Now, while I don't agree with them on a lot of things, I do agree that there is a big problem in academia, particularly in the social sciences and the humanities, and they are underlining that, and they are having the conversations that people won't within the visible structure that already exists, the academic structure that already exists. So that's the sense in which it's a dark web. It's a group of people, most of whom aren't really very right-wing at all, to be honest. They're more the dissident left than anything else, though with a few libertarians thrown into the bunch.
If the argument is convincing, you change your mind, great stuff. So given that this is the way that they brand themselves, and given their politics, you would expect them to be constantly critiquing Marxism.
I've had to chop this up for length and because of content ID and all these other problems, and I think the irony of being copyright struck by Marxists would finish me off, so I've had to chop it up. If you want to see the full context, go and watch the full video on their channel. I think the issue here that he's not really quite grasping is one that I think a lot of Marxists have trouble with, that at least in academia, in the social sciences and so on, they are the hegemonic power that controls everything. They're not the rebels, they're not the dissidents anymore, they're the establishment. I think a lot of revolutionaries have a very hard time understanding when that occurs. I also think here there's a good reason that they don't spend an awful lot of time critiquing Marxism, though I would say probably Peterson does waffle on about it a lot, and certainly Shapiro likes to Venezuela about everything. So they do critique it, but not in any particularly deep way, because I think they believe that this is now a settled argument since the collapse of the Soviet Union and the terrible consequences of any other large-scale experiment with Marxism. So I don't think that they feel that there is a case to answer anymore. And if you believe there is, you should probably make one, rather than complaining that they're not conjuring an argument for Marxism out of nowhere to steel man and debate. If you want them to tackle this argument, I think you'd have to make it.
Obviously, I'm on the other end of the spectrum from these fellows. Ben Shapiro is a self-identified proud conservative. Most of the rest, as far as I can tell, claim to be classical liberals.
A spectrum is a spectrum. It's not a binary one thing on the other. Now you're way over here to the left in Marxist territory. Way over to the right, the opposite side of the spectrum would be fascism, really. Now Shapiro is pretty far over to the right, but he's not a fascist, so not really the opposite side of the spectrum to you. Marxism's pretty extreme. Harris and so on are pretty centre-left, so not very far from you comparatively at all. You know, a spectrum isn't a binary. And then a lot of these people are on the left, but they're also libertarian rather than authoritarian. Now that's where a lot of the disruption and problems and fighting and critique that comes within the left is libertarian left people taking issue with the authoritarian left, which would be where Marxism lies, certainly in practice, and quite a great deal in theory as well.
I'm a socialist. I'm not just a everybody should have healthcare socialist. I'm a full-on workers' control of the means of production Marxist socialist.
You make the distinction that you're a Marxist socialist, which is welcome. Most people don't differentiate, but Marxism appropriated, ironically enough, the term socialism from the previous utopian socialists. This was differentiated, Engels in particular bangs on about this, as Marxism being scientific socialism, whereas they were dismissive in calling other forms of socialism utopian. However, I think history has borne out that the utopian socialists were correct, and the more pragmatic, the more scientific socialists, while Marxism has become a secular religion. You know, this comparison keeps popping up all over the place in regards to social justice warrior type ideology and so on, but Marxism equally, it's a faith at this point. What differentiates a science from a faith or an ideology is that in science things are falsifiable. And surely the consistent and constant failure of Marxism to work anywhere save on a very small scale of an ideologically cohesive unit, surely that has falsified the Marxist hypothesis. Surely. So it would be a mark of a scientific socialist, as Marxists like to style themselves, to admit that there is a problem here, that it is broken, that it doesn't work, and that the hypothesis needs to be revisited and revised. But there's precious little of that has gone on, other than in these horror shows, people seeking to justify the things that they have done. And Marx isn't innocent of this either. He mentions revolutions, he mentions violence and the necessity of violence and so on in his writings, in his commentaries. So he's not innocent of the way in which people have interpreted what he has written. And again, the comparison to religion is probably the most valid, because religious texts are subject to critique because they very often call directly for violence. And so the religion, the text, and the mysterious figures in the past, or in other religions, the present that wrote it, should be accountable for the things that they have encouraged or allowed through their writing.
Also, if you have the time, would you be willing to sign my copy of the Communist Manifesto so I can send some very interesting messages back home?
Yeah, I will make you read the inscription out loud now.
This book sucks, by Ben Shapiro.
I don't expect much in the way of an intellectual dissection of Marxism from the Poisoned Dwarf in any case, and certainly not at a public event where he's engaged to speak on a particular topic, and it's more of a political rally than an intellectual discussion per se. I think the debates and so on that Harris and so on have done are a lot better, but they're not really there to critique Marxism. If you want that to happen, again, you're going to have to make an argument and present it to them.
When Shapiro can be bothered to work out more of an argument than "this book sucks," it tends to take the form of a recitation of Stalinist atrocities. For example,
Karl Marx's idiotic philosophy led to the deaths of well over 100 million people during the 20th century alone.
There's a number of valid critiques to be made of this set of issues that they present, the atrocities and so on. But at the heart of it is this critique that Marxism has gone off the rails every time it has been tried at scale, which rather suggests that there is a problem with Marxism rather than anything else. I mean, they are dishonest in the way that they inflate these numbers. For example, they include all the deaths of starvation and so on due to Lysenkoism, and that's not murder, that's incompetence. And they fail to take into account things like the Soviet Union existed for a far longer period of time than, say, Nazi Germany did, which is the right-wing example of an atrocious fascistic far-right regime. They also don't tend to attribute deaths to capitalism quite so easily as they do to Marxism. But there is a problem here. Marxism consistently and constantly goes off the rails at exactly the same point, and many, many deaths occur. The arguments of the Poisoned Dwarf are simplistic, idiotic, designed to play into, 70 years of propaganda directed at the American people against anything that even slightly whiffs of left-wing politics. So there's good reasons to go after it, but you don't do any of those. Instead, you spend a lengthy period in this part of the video pointing out that this is a fallacy, a guilt by association, and a plea to consequences, amongst other things. But you just repeat the error by making that same argument yourself. And I think you're ignoring that what they're really perhaps getting at, if we are going to steelman their position, is that these are consequences of Marxism going wrong, and Marxism always seems to go wrong.
He said, he criticized my criticism of Marx. He said, well, that Peterson, he's basically stuck in 1989. It's like, we've progressed way past the time of the Stalinists. It's like, and I thought, well, how about if a Nazi said that?
Peterson argues a lot from emotion, yes, but he doesn't attack in quite the same sad little way that the Poisoned Dwarf does. Kermit is a little bit more sophisticated on that, and his argument here, while flippant and somewhat comedic, is a good one. Well, the irony here is he often defends religion, and whether you're criticizing Marxists or ardent capitalists or religious apologists, you often run into the same sort of thing when they try to defend what they believe. And that's why I keep making these constant comparisons to religion, because the experience that I have, albeit subjectively, when arguing ideology with people tends to mirror the experience I have when I'm arguing with religious apologists, in saying, oh, well, things have moved on, socialist thought, Marxist, not really socialist thought, has developed. Oh, Christian thought has evolved since then. Our beliefs are much more sophisticated. No, you're bullshit. has become much more sophisticated. Oh, this, that, the other is allegory or whatever else. Yeah, this same kind of dishonest dodging and hedging goes on in religious apologism as it does in ideological apologism.
When you talk about classical liberalism, you know, even though I'm not sure how seriously to take some of these guys' pretensions to classical liberalism. These days, even Sargon of Akkad calls himself a classical liberal, so it doesn't mean much.
This is from the middle of a self-contradicting diatribe where he is accusing people of making, you know, genetic fallacies, bad company fallacy arguments against Marxism, but doing exactly the same thing for a whole host of other bits. And I don't think the comparisons are entirely valid because, you know, Marx advocates for and excuses violence and the dictatorship of the proletariat and all the rest of it. So, you know, it's hard-coded into the DNA of Marxism in a way it isn't necessarily in other ideologies, though it would be in say, fascism. But I just wanted to pluck this out because it's also disingenuous. Now, I don't agree with Sargon much at all anymore, except on free expression issues. I do think he has slid to the right, but you can have a liberal right, a libertarian right, just as you can have a liberal or libertarian left, or you can have authoritarian and anti-liberal, if you will. He's called himself a classical liberal for a very long time. This isn't a new phenomenon. It goes back years, and lots of other people have taken that stance. It's a kind of softened libertarian stance. Now, I don't agree with him on a lot of this. I think many of the things that he's now advocating for, such as the populist nationalism that drives UKIP and similar groups, I think that's profoundly dangerous. It's unliberal. It is authoritarian. And I think a lot of the reasons that he attacks things like the EU and so on are invalid and will lead to more, not less, authoritarianism. But nonetheless, you can't just say he's not a classical liberal. He identifies as that, if you will. His viewpoints can certainly be seen to be consistent with classical liberalism. So you can't just dismiss it out of hand. I mean, I could say you're not a Marxist because you're not advocating for violent revolution. That would be a disservice to you and would be rude, would it not?
Just because some bad people say they endorse an idea, that tells you absolutely nothing about the idea itself or any arguments that have been made for it. You have to evaluate these things independently. Okay.
So there's a similar kind of argument to the ones that people make against computer games or role-playing games or comic books or whatever else that they cause violence. There's not even any correlation, and correlation doesn't indicate causation, and just because people say there's something doesn't mean that they are. But in the case of Marxism, as in the case of religion, we can look to the texts, we can look to the comments, we can look to, you know, what the book, what the body of work endorses, and in the case of Marxism, violent revolution, the dictatorship of the proletariat, and so on. And we can also look at results, such as the murderous dictatorship of Stalin, and as I've pointed out before, it seems to go off the rails at exactly the same point. Marxist socialism, total state control of everything, becomes vulnerable to being taken over by bad actors at that point and failing. You know, so the hypothesis, if you will, has been falsified in practice. And if Marxism was scientific, it would then have to go back and either discard or revise the theory in light of all these events and so on. So while it is fallacious to just go Venezuela or whatever, yeah, just because something's a fallacy doesn't mean that it doesn't have some validity to it. The fallacy. Yeah, you have to look at the whole of the argument and how they've come to that end and why they're pointing to these examples.
This one is called the fallacy of equivocation. The fallacy of equivocation is committed in arguments like this one. So, premise 1, P1, only men are rational. P2, women are not men. Conclusion, women are not rational. All right, now, given the views of some of these intellectual dark web guys on the ladies, some of them might get excited at this point, but of course this is a logically fallacious argument. On the face of it, it looks like it should actually be deductively valid. That if only people in category A have some trait and women don't fit into category A, then they don't have that trait. But the reason that it's not only not deductively valid, it's not a good argument in any way, is that there's a key term that's used in two different senses in two different parts of the argument, and the surface appearance that it's valid relies on that equivocation. All right.
I think that qualifies as a straw man argument, because I don't think you will find any of them advocating for what you've said there and implied that they don't think women can be logical. And the term men is being used in the same way in both instances there, unless you're making some kind of gender revisionist definition and inserting it into their argument where it's not applicable.
Fair enough. Maybe Shapiro and Peterson have a good anti-socialist inductive argument. So what does that look like? It seems like it's going to be something like this, that say, oh, well, socialism has been tried many times before, and we've gotten gulags and bread lines and all these bad results. So what makes you think this time will be different?
I'm fully aware that I'm flogging a dead horse at this point, but socialism has been tried. It is enacted to one degree or another in every first world Western nation and a lot of second world nations and even third world nations. And it's a wild success everywhere. That is what some people call welfare capitalism. When he refers to socialism, he is referring to Marxist socialism, which is the absolute state control and running of everything in the name of the people, which is then supposed to kind of melt away by some unspecified process to becoming communism. So there's a massive, overwhelming difference between Marxist socialism and socialism as its own ideology, as people describe it and as it is implemented, and it's very important to bear that in mind.
P1, socialism has been tried many times before. So we're talking Russia, China, Vietnam, etc. Premise 2, socialism has led to bad results in the past. Conclusion, socialism will lead to bad results if we try again.
Right, keep in mind, again, this is talking about the Marxist concept of socialism, one of these stages of history from historical materialism. You go from capitalism to socialism to communism, except in practice we never seem to get past that whole dictatorship, one-party state thing. This is different to socialism as it is practiced and understood as its own ideology, separate and distinct from Marxism. And honestly, I blame people like this for the constant and consistent misunderstandings of what socialism is. If you're referring to Marxist socialism, I think you should just call it Marxism to differentiate it.
Here's what's not fine. That this argument commits the fallacy of equivocation. That socialism, in the first premise and in the second premise, refers to a system of one-party totalitarian dictatorship with the economy being planned from the top down by state bureaucrats and workplaces being just as hierarchical as they are under capitalism. And socialism, in the conclusion, means the kind of socialism that Richard Wolff advocates, the kind of socialism that Michael Harrington advocates, the kind of socialism that Marx and Engels and Rosa Luxemburg advocate. And I just mentioned a diverse group of thinkers. They would disagree with each other on various details, but they all agree that the heart of socialism is the extension of democracy from politics to economics, that if it's not democratic, it's not socialist.
Now, this is a fallacy of redefinition. I mean, it's not that surprising. Marxists stole the term socialism and redefined it in the first place, but you're willfully redefining the terms. Marxist socialism, Marxism as it is set out in the founding texts and documents, is, as you have described, but that is then supposed to winnow away to communism, which is the ideal that you're pointing towards. The problem is that it never gets there. The materialist interpretation of history is wrong. The Marxist theory of how things will progress is wrong. It doesn't work that way, at least not the way Marx laid out, or any of the other thinkers that you've mentioned particularly. So you're trying to redefine the bad Marxist socialism as softer or good or nicer forms of Marxist socialism, which cannot really be said to be Marxist socialism, some perhaps cooperatives or syndicalism, something like that. So you should use those terms rather than trying to whitewash Marxist socialism.
Well, the no true Scotsman fallacy is committed when you shift the goalposts, that you change the definition in order to get around an objection. And it strikes me that the dynamic here is actually the opposite of that. That historically, before the rise of Stalinism, everybody used the word socialism to mean economic democracy.
You dense motherfucker. You just done it again. The same fallacy of redefinition, the same no true Scotsman fallacy. Marxists redefined the term socialism. What has it been understood to mean? Greater equality, greater fairness, equality before the law, deconstructing systems of control. Yeah, that's what it has meant, until Marxists came in and redefined it and turned it into something else, of which the consequence has been Stalinism and similar issues.
But let's say, for the sake of argument, I'm wrong about all that. Let's say that whatever the right way to think of the word socialism is, the right definition of socialism is one that's so broad, it's so all-encompassing, that it includes both the economic democracy advocated by a Rosa Luxemburg, who wanted democratic economic planning, or a Richard Wolff, who might think that, well, some things should be nationalized, but there should be a market sector of competing workers' cooperatives. It's so broad that it includes those visions, and it also includes Stalinism. Or hell, let's say for the sake of argument that socialism should be defined in a way that only applies to Stalinism, that economic democracy doesn't even count. Well, if so, that's still an equivocation, because in the premises, socialism is being used in the correct way, and in the conclusion, at least to the extent that this argument is being directed against democratic Marxists like Richard Wolff, the word socialism is being used to describe economic democracy. One way or the other, there's still a fallacy of equivocation going on there.
I still think it's more a fallacy of redefinition going on your part. You don't want to be associated, for good reason, with Stalinism, with Pol Pot, yeah, whoever else, these repressive dictators. Might be, but there's no real escaping from that. I mean, you're redefining, misdefining, wrongly defining socialism anyway, in all of these instances, as Marxists have for some time. And I blame people like you as much as Ben Shapiro for people's misunderstanding of what socialism is. Now, if you proclaim yourself to be a Marxist, you're necessarily subscribing to certain ideas that appear in Marxism, just as if I were to declare myself a Christian, there would be a certain core set of beliefs that you would rightly assume would apply to me. And if I strayed beyond those beliefs, or didn't hold some key beliefs that were part of that religion, or in this case a political ideology, you know, it wouldn't be wrong to say that I am not that thing. So if you subscribe to Marxism, you're subscribing to the theory of historical materialism, you're subscribing to advocacy for violent overthrow of the existing status quo, and all of these other things. If you're not, then you no longer fit the definition of Marxist. What this really demonstrates to me as a whole is a problem that I see everywhere all the time, with people willfully, even deliberately, redefining terms. You see it where people redefine racism to prejudice plus power, or sexism to prejudice plus power. It's not what it means. It's not what most people understand by the term, rightly or wrongly. And we see the same problem here. You know, Marxism means something. It refers to a particular set of ideals, a particular set of theories. So if you call yourself a Marxist, you can't really blame people for inferring from that you hold to those Marxist ideals. This is why I think it's so important in all of these discussions to be clear about what you mean. That's why I belabor the point about socialism, and it's why I try to define terms, even if I'm doing it quickly, even if I've already defined them 1,000 times before, just so everyone knows where I'm coming from. There's still misunderstanding, but it helps to minimize that. I mean, people like to dismiss arguments as semantic arguments, but semantics refers to the meaning of terms, the meaning of words, semantic semiotics. And if we don't have a common understanding of what these terms mean, then we can't communicate. If I say fish, but what I mean by fish refers to what you refer to as a tree, we're going to have a very confusing conversation next time we go to the garden centre, you know? So, but call yourself a Marxist if you like, but you need to make sure that the other party involved in the debate, involved in the discussion, knows what you mean by that term. And it's important that you know what they understand by that term. So if you're calling yourself, erroneously I would say, a Marxist, but you're talking about syndicalist workers' cooperatives or whatever else, you know, you need to explain that so that they understand that that's what you mean, rather than Marxist socialism, the total and absolute state control of everything. I mean, a lot of these modern Marxists talk about things like late-stage capitalism. It's not really a new idea, though everyone, including Marx, thought the revolution would have taken place already in industrialized nations by now. And it refers back to that flawed, broken, inaccurate, wrong idea of the stages of history, of an evolutionary path of historical materialism. It's not what's happening. If you're waiting for any kind of socialist utopia to result from what's happening at the moment, I think you're going to be sorely disappointed. And I think we're going to continue to see this slow gradation into socialism in the proper term, the proper meaning of it, as automation and so on. ramps up. You know, capitalism creates wealth, socialism tells us how to redistribute, reinvest that to create a better, more equitable society. Socialism is capitalism's conscience. Zang.
They call me back door Santa. I make my runs about the break of day.